So we need Ari Berman in the front row. And everyone, please take a seat. Good evening, and welcome to the 21st lecture of the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. This series is dedicated to confronting some of the most urgent issues facing our people, consistently addressing Dr. Martin Luther King's question, where do we go from here, chaos or community? Over the course of the past 8 years, the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series has featured iconic leaders, men and women, who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of strengthening our nation's democracy. Shining light on grave contradictions and inequities, they've offered insights, illuminating pathways in the dedicated pursuit of a stronger, better nation. Tonight's lecture could not be more timely. We come together tonight amidst a flurry of competing interests and forces that are wrestling economic, electoral, climate, and policy matters with implications that will decisively define how we have behaved as a nation, as a people, for a very long time to come. It is our hope that what we share together tonight will assist us, individually and collectively, to harness the curiosity, creativity, discipline, and courage that is required to actively engage in influencing the course of the months ahead. So let's dig in. Merritt College co-produces the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. The Freedom Center is honored to be housed on the campus of Merritt College. Dr. Marie Elaine Burns is the president. Dr. Burns has an impressive career in higher education, having worked in various college settings throughout the state, always with a focus of college access, student retention, support services, and graduation success. Please give Dr. Marie Elaine Burns a warm welcome.
Good evening. It is my pleasure and great honor, on behalf of Merritt College and in partnership with the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center, to welcome all of you and our distinguished speaker, Mr. Ari Berman, to this evening's Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most comprehensive civil rights legislation ever enacted by Congress. It contained extensive measures to dismantle Jim Crow segregation and combat racial discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 removed barriers to Black enfranchisement in the South, banning poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures that effectively prevented African Americans from voting. However, since the passage of the aforementioned congressional acts, voter suppression raises its ugly head all too often and is alive and well. This is why it's so important for us to hear from Mr. Ari Berman tonight as he shares with us his experiences, research, insights, and thoughts into this important issue. Finally, I'm especially proud that Merritt College supports and partners with the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center, where young people develop nonviolent leadership and conflict resolution skills and have been taught to advocate for voter registration. They knock on doors, young people in high school, to help us move forward. And this is done by the MLK Center. The skills that the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center teaches these young folks helps to positively impact their neighborhoods, communities, the nation, and the world. And I am grateful for the center's continued sponsorship of this much-needed social justice platform, the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. Together, we, all of you, all of us, will keep the dream alive. Thank you and welcome.
Dr. Roy Wilson directs the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center. The staff of the Freedom Center host classes and civic engagement activities with a focus on intergenerational and interracial community development. Elders, youth, and family members organize to advocate for legislation and policy changes, addressing pressing issues such as ending childhood poverty, the human right to water, voter education and registration, civics classes, and active civic opportunities for all students K through 12, and reducing police use of force and violence in our communities. Please welcome Dr. Roy Wilson.
Good evening, everyone. Like the kids say, vote, vote, let's get out and vote. It's really great to be together tonight. Let me start by thanking the Peralta Community College District and our home, Merritt College. Dr. Burns, it's a joy to bring students week after week, month after month. Even when the college is closed down, we have high school students on our beautiful progressive campus. We appreciate you and the Merritt faculty and staff. Let me give props to our board. The best board that any progressive group that's a nonprofit that's really kind of trying to fit in to be a nonprofit, because what we really do is a calling, and there's just not an IRS category for those with a calling. And we're led by an incredible group of people. First is our chairman, the Honorable Elihu Harris. Give Elihu a hand, please. Our vice chair, Sandra Andrews. Our secretary, Royal Roberts. Directors, Audrey Jones-Taylor, Carol Johnson, Alton Jelks, Dr. Bill Riley, and Michael Leidy. Give our board a hand, please. Thanks to our sponsors. We have a major sponsor, Gilead Sciences. Our lead sponsors, Blaisdell's Business Products, and contributing sponsors include the California Endowment, California Waste Solutions, Comerica Bank, East Bay Community Foundation, East Bay Regional Parks District, IBEW, ICL, and Wells Fargo. Thank you, everybody who are funders and sponsors of tonight and the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. We have a category called collaborators, and they're organizations that bring individuals, either their staff or their constituents, and there's in the program a list of tonight's collaborators. And there's something really special about that relationship, because it works between the lectures and not just when the lectures are happening. And it's a joy to be part of so many organizations in their work and our work together. So please give our collaborators a warm hand. We're joined by our BART director, Robert Rayburn, And thank you for being here. And Peggy McQuaid, our Vice Mayor of the City of Albany. Give both of them a hand. And the young people, while doing voter education, voter registration in Kern County 3 years ago, became acquainted with the fear that would lead people to say, my vote does not count. We used to think it was apathy, but they were good surveyors, and they knocked on 7,400 doors, and they were able to conclude, in their opinion, most people who don't vote are afraid of voting, either afraid of being embarrassed because they don't know where or how. And I think if there's somebody in here that can actually grasp the California voters pamphlet, which is like a telephone book at this point, they're afraid that they don't know what the issues are. So we're dedicated to making sure that everyone knows that to us you matter, and together through courage and through friendship and solidarity, we will increase our capacity to run this country. Thank you for being here tonight, and God bless.
So we want to take just a quick minute to point out some of the tables that are in the room tonight. We have the U.S. Census Bureau here, Lydia Beltran, and thank you, Lydia. And from the League of Women Voters, Louise and Cynthia are with us this evening. And we also have, yes, and we're going to say just a little bit more about that in a minute, Joy and Justice, which is actually a project that the Freedom Center is very proud of, sponsored by our Alameda County Supervisor, Nate Miley. There's a table here tonight for Joy and Justice, as well as the Freedom Center, and a table with Ari Berman's books for sale. So at the end of the evening, one thing I'd like to say is several of these tables do have both paid as well as volunteer opportunities for us all to get involved in voter education, voter registration, but also the all-important census counting that needs to start formally and officially early in April. And the U.S. Census Bureau actually even has paid jobs for the very hard work that we're going to need to do together collectively to knock on doors in these hard-to-count parts of our communities to make sure, so very vital, that we all get counted heading into the census for 2020. Supervisor Nate Miley, a very dear friend of the Freedom Centers, really understands the importance of bringing together youth and elders. Throughout this summer, you may have come across some tables or t-shirts that have the big J&J. Our young people and our elders have been doing some voter registration together. Alameda County Supervisor Nate Miley launched this effort to assure that local residents are given every opportunity to vote, to be counted, and to get involved civically. Supervisor Miley is serving his 5th term on the County Board of Supervisors. Please welcome Supervisor Nate Miley.
Thank you, Karen. So good evening, everyone. It's good to see practically a full house. These lecture series are so vitally important and relevant, and this one this evening is right on point, right on target. And this year we launched our Joy and Justice effort with the Black Joy Parade that took place in February here in Oakland, raising joy to be African American and the things that African Americans stand for, justice, joy, inclusivity, things of positivity, things of that nature. So the Joy and Justice was launched so that we could encourage not just African Americans, but other people of color, young people, anyone and everyone to get involved. Joy and Justice isn't just about voting. It's about getting involved. It's about civic engagement. Sometimes people, maybe they have the status of an immigrant. Maybe they're too young to vote, but there's still an opportunity to get engaged, to get involved, to be civically responsible, and encourage others to get involved and be civically responsible, and encourage others who can vote to get out and vote. So Joy and Justice is about civic engagement, civic responsibility, registering to vote, and then when you register to vote, definitely voting. Too many people stayed home in the last election, and if folks don't think elections have consequences, I don't know what it's going to take. Do you think elections have consequences, yes or no? It doesn't sound like it. Do you think elections have consequences? Yes or no? Yes, yes. I think elections do have consequences because I think they have consequences at all levels, but if we just look at the national level, you can see the consequences of people not getting out and voting. And so voting, registering to vote, civic engagement, they all work hand in hand. And then advocacy as a part of that is vitally important. So the Joy and Justice effort is something that was launched out of my office. We've worked very closely with the Martin Luther King Freedom Center. I tell you, they're one of our partners, but they are our star partner. I mean, those young people are just amazing. I mean, they really are amazing. I can go talk to folks, but when the young people go talk to somebody, it's very meaningful and very powerful. And not just talking to their peers, but talking to adults and young adults and others. It's very powerful. They were at a couple of events with us, and they've been coming to other events, talking to people at track meets, talking to people at graduation ceremonies, talking to people at parades and other festivals and events. I mean, they are just amazing. So I just want to take my hat off to the Martin Luther King Freedom Center, the board of directors, of which I know many of them. You know, I served on the city council with Mayor Elihu Harris back in the good old days. Served with Mayor Harris. So the fact of the Freedom Center and what they do to train the young people, to build up their confidence, make them knowledgeable, to have them be responsible, and then to impart that to others. I can't say enough about that. I've actually seen it working, and I've seen it on display. And so I just want to thank you, and I want to encourage everyone, get engaged. I know I'm not going to be able to hear the speaker this evening, but I hope it's being recorded. Tony and I have about 5 events we have to get to this evening. This is like the 3rd event, but Asa from my staff will be here. But I'm looking forward to at least hearing your remarks if they're recorded. And I know this is going to be very important because I think in the Bay Area, people might be engaged, but there's always room for folks to be even more civically engaged, not just here, but all throughout this country and throughout this world. Because what affects us, you know, politics is local, but trust me, if we're not engaged and start all those prairie fires all over the place, then we have consequences to pay for it, both here in our country and abroad. So I just want to thank the Martin Luther King Freedom Center. I want to thank those young people. Let's give them a round of applause.
So before you slip out the door, yes, it is going, tonight's event is actually being live streamed, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center has a YouTube channel, and Ari's lecture tonight will also be available on our, go to YouTube and type in Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center, and it will be there. So we'll look forward to you being able to, you know, tap into that. Elihu Harris's career in public service includes 12 years as state assembly member, during which time, in 1981, he wrote the legislation designating Dr. King's birthday as a California state holiday, which was recognized in '86 at the federal level, but wasn't observed in all states until 20 years later. Mr. Harris served 2 terms as mayor of Oakland, and then, as we've heard him say, he held one of his favorite jobs, the longest standing and particularly student and community-centered chancellorship of the Peralta Community College District. The Freedom Center benefits greatly from his role as our chairman of the board, but also for many of us, a very, very dear friend and really one of our primary headlights and mentors. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Elihu Harris.
Karen, thank you very much. I wanted to tell Supervisor Miley and I were elected to the Oakland City Council the same year, but I was coming from the State Assembly and he was a community organizer. He was causing troubles. I was part of the solution. A month ago, so I had a birthday, and it was in Oakland, Chinatown. And it was the fundraiser for our county assessor who just gotten elected and had a deficit. And during the course of that dinner, one of the members of the city council was the MC. And it happened to be my birthday. So she said, "We have a special guest here tonight. And I want all of you to join with me in celebrating his birthday. So let's all join in and sing happy birthday to Mayor Willie Brown." That was bad enough, but they had Willie's name on the cake. So I called Willie the next day, and I said, "Look, how did you preempt the title of mayor so that whenever somebody says it, they immediately say Willie Brown?" I said, "Look, I'm glad you haven't been chancellor of a community college district. You've done everything else I've done. Lawyer, attorney, all this." But Willie is someone who, again, has really done great things in the state of California. And whatever accolades that he gets, he deserves. Anyone who could say 15 years as Speaker of the California Assembly is somebody who is more than unique. So tonight, we're here to talk about voter suppression. For any of you who were born after the baby boom, you may not fully understand what voter suppression is. Because when you think about color lines and literacy tests and poll taxes that were so common in the South that in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, we thought that was going to be the end of that level of voter suppression. But over the last 20 years, we have seen a return to that type of proactive effort to try to suppress the vote. We've seen the consequences of suppressing the vote at every level of government. And a book that you should read if you have it is called Dark Money. I'm not saying don't buy Ari's book, because that's a later book, but Dark Money talks about the Koch brothers and what they did to try to take over politics in this country. They and their colleagues did everything, not just voter suppression, but also they have done gerrymandering. And now with the Supreme Court that has now taken away the Voting Rights Act as an active part of the Justice Department's agenda and said that gerrymandering is okay. You understand we're in a crisis. And it's that and the fact that it wasn't the people who voted for that fool in the White House. I'm not going to call his name, but you know who he is. And if you don't see him on a wanted poster soon, then justice will not be served. But at any rate, they have indicated that there is no longer a requirement that we look at gerrymandering as something that is inappropriate. If a political body does it, and certainly if it's a political body in the South, you look at what's going on in North Carolina and Alabama and Mississippi. You look at what's going on in all these states that have now flipped the script with their state legislatures, who have now concentrated progressive minority voters of color into one district. so they no longer will have their representation throughout the state or the city in which they live, then you understand this is not a joke. This is not a game. This is a business with serious consequences. Some of us in California think that because things are better here, that, again, elections don't have consequences. But we know that they do. So we're here today because we want to impress upon all of us that we have to be involved and we have to be engaged. Because you know what the biggest threat to democracy is? It's not even the fool in the White House. It's ignorant voters. I'm more afraid of his supporters than I am of him. You know, I mean, they voted for that fool. And they did it understanding he was ignorant, he's a racist, a misogynist. How much more could you know about somebody than we know about the man in the White House? And I'm telling you one thing, you know, I used to have respect for Republicans. I just disagreed with them philosophically. But you know what? If you're a white evangelist, or any evangelist, or you're a Republican, and somehow you can rationalize morality with a man with no compass, I'm really kind of baffled by all of that. You know, I don't say you change your registration, but hey, decline to state is not a bad way to go. Because in the final analysis, you know, when we allow someone like that to give this image of this country worldwide, to kind of say this is what America is, then we all should be embarrassed. We all should be vigorously working to make sure that our young people understand that is not the American dream. His vision is one of racism and economic oppression. And if we think that's okay, shame on us.
At this point in the program, we would like to ask each of you to consider supporting the work of the Freedom Center. At your seats tonight, there should be a card, looks like this. As the young people are coming forward and with the baskets, please consider making a generous contribution to the work of the Freedom Center. We can take checks, cash, credit cards. If you want to write a little note with your phone number, we'll call you back in the basket. But also on the card, we just wanted to point out tonight, thanks to our board member, Alton Jelks, who about a year ago helped us roll out this monthly contributor concept, we'd like to invite you to become a monthly sustaining supporter of the Freedom Center's work. Any amount every month is extremely helpful because it really helps to create a sustained revenue for the work that we're doing with our young people. And if you are interested or available or willing to have one of us call you, if you could go ahead and put your information on the card or even just your name and number, and we will be getting back to you. So young people, you can go ahead and start with the baskets. And as we're doing that, actually the young people have a brief video that they want to share with you. Go ahead and start the baskets. That's fine. Thanks. So Roy mentioned for each summer for 6 weeks, the students travel. And Ari, summer before last, when we were in the Central Valley in 110-degree weather, knocking on 7,000 doors, they also do these really intensive classes. And I think it's so cool because they studied your book, Ari. They studied Give Us the Ballot that summer, along with Noam Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream and a few others. But it's beautiful study and really important work. So they wanted to share this very brief video, just a couple minutes, on the summer program with us right now as the baskets go around.
This tour is 24 hours for 6 weeks.
It's physically difficult, and when something's physically difficult, it easily gets emotionally difficult.
I've learned a lot about myself and the world that we live in.
I always thought individually instead of globally.
You have to be really brave during this program because we do all types of work. Not only are we engaged culturally, we're engaged civically, we're engaged politically. So it requires a lot of learning and being willing to learn and putting yourself in a position to be taught.
Like here, when you're given a job, you have to do it immediately, because right after it, there's more work to do.
Being with 30+ people every day, waking up.
I had no idea what to really expect.
oh, camping outside, tents. I'm like, ooh, okay.
I think it's all worth it. It's part of the sacrifice. Part of the sacrifice to sacrifice your phone, sacrifice being without your family for just a few weeks. But you will not get a chance to have a group like this contributing to society, making a difference forever. This is only 6 weeks. 6 weeks of a whole lifetime.
Meeting with these judges, meeting with tribal leaders, meeting with African Americans that are still fighting today. It's like history never stopped.
The personal transformation, this part, is something that the staff and interns go through as well.
Just seeing like everyone grow as like people.
I've learned a lot of different perspectives, just living with these people, hearing all their different voices.
Now that I see how it ended up at the end, I'm just so happy I did it.
It gives you a bigger purpose.
Doing this work is not something that you will regret.
To us, you do matter, and it's important that you get out there and you do this work because not everyone is doing it, so your hands will make a difference.
Thank you for your contributions. And I just want to let you know we have a slight change in the program order. Congresswoman Barbara Lee will be offering closing remarks this evening after our keynote speaker. Mr. Ari Berman is a writer, researcher, reporter, public spokesperson, and among many other things also a father. Mr. Berman's contributions have enlightened readers and listeners to some of the most compelling threats to our democracy: voter suppression, systematic gerrymandering, rigged census, attacks on the free press, economic inequity, and the profound influence of money on American politics. His stories have been featured in the New York Times, Mother Jones, where he currently serves as senior reporter, the Washington Post, the Rolling Stone, the Nation, and he is a frequent guest on MSNBC, C-SPAN, and NPR. In addition to the 2 books he's authored, Give Us the Ballot, which we've talked about tonight, and a second one entitled Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics, Ari is currently working on a new book entitled Minority Rule, addressing anti-democratic efforts to entrench the white minority and the movements to resist it. Hillary Clinton has referred to Ari as one of our nation's most definitive scholars and reporters on the struggle for voting rights. Please welcome author, journalist, and democracy headlight Ari Berman to the stage.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? You can hear me in the back? Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for that introduction. Father is the most important word in my title because when I come home, my 17-month-old and my almost 5-year-old have no idea about all the rest of the stuff. So they're just glad that I'm dad. But it's a real honor to be here. I want to thank all the elected officials that are here, Mayor Harris, Supervisor Miley, everyone else. I want to thank Merritt College for bringing me out here, and obviously the Freedom Center itself for bringing me here, and Congresswoman Lee, of course. So this is obviously a time when a lot of people are thinking about democracy, and a lot of people are thinking about threats to democracy. So I will get to all of that, but I want to talk a little bit about the history first to give some historical context. So the title of my book, Give Us the Ballot, comes from the first major speech that Martin Luther King gave about voting rights in 1957. He was only 28 years old at the time, and he gave this speech at the Lincoln Memorial. It was really the first major gathering of African Americans in Washington, D.C. after Rosa Parks and others had led the Montgomery bus boycott. And King gave this speech in May of 1957
because it was the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision that was supposed to desegregate public schools. But barely a single public school in the South had desegregated at that point in time. And King was asking the question, why? How could the highest court in the land say to schools, you must desegregate, and not an entire school desegregated? And it was because the South and parts of the country that weren't the South were still controlled by segregationists who pledged massive resistance to the civil rights movement, to school desegregation, and everything else. So King gave this speech at the Lincoln Memorial. In many ways, this was the precursor to the March on Washington that took place 6 years later. And King said, we say to the president, and we say to every member of Congress, our most urgent demand is to give us the right to vote. And that speech and that movement culminated 8 years later in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But what King was addressing was really this fundamental contradiction in American history, which if you go all the way back, our founding fathers said, all men are created equal. We'll leave out the fact that they excluded women. They said all men are created equal. But they didn't want all men or all women to be able to vote. States very explicitly restricted voting rights to white male property owners, which excluded poor whites and women and African Americans and new immigrants and Native Americans, and so many people in this room would not have been able to vote at the time of our founding. And so it took a long time after that, nearly 100 years after that, to get the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, which very explicitly said the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It's really the only time we've had a guarantee of civil rights and equal rights in our Constitution. And those words meant something for a very brief period of time during Reconstruction. We had black senators and black governors from states like Mississippi and Louisiana, something that's never happened since. We had truly integrated government in the South for the first time in this nation's history. But then federal troops left, and we began to see things like poll taxes and literacy tests and widespread violence, lynchings against African Americans, and that's how we got nearly 100 years of Jim Crow. So before the Voting Rights Act, if you wanted to vote in a place like Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote, you had to name all 67 county judges to even register to vote. Something that I'm fairly certain the 67 county judges themselves would not have been able to do if they ever were asked that very question. There were people like Andrew Goodman and James Chaney and Michael Schwerner who went down to Mississippi and never came back, who were murdered simply for trying to register people to vote. That's our history, and it's not that long ago. It's only 50-something years ago. It's not that long ago. And so the Voting Rights Act struck down those literacy tests and those poll taxes and those grandfathering clauses and those property requirements, all the things that prevented African Americans and so many others from being able to register and vote in the Jim Crow South. And we saw integrated government, not just in the South, but in so much of the country for the first time. We saw the election of the first African American leaders, the first Hispanic leaders, the first Asian American leaders, the first Latino leaders. We saw multiracial government in this country for the first time. And it didn't just affect the South. The Voting Rights Act was expanded in 1975 to cover language minority groups. So Latinos, Asian Americans, others that may not have spoken English or may have faced their own versions of literacy tests and poll taxes. And that covered California. So California was directly impacted by the Voting Rights Act in addition to all of those southern states. But I'd be lying if I said I thought about this history a lot when I was growing up. I didn't grow up in the Jim Crow South. My parents didn't meet marching in Selma. I knew this history, I was aware of this history, but I think like a lot of people, I didn't think it really affected me. So for me, my come to Jesus moment, even though I'm Jewish, was was after the 2010 election. And what happened after the 2010 election was a direct response, not just to the election of the first black president, but to the coalition that elected the first black president. That there were 5 million new voters that cast a ballot in 2008. Of those 5 million new voters, nearly all of them were voters of color. 2 million new African American voters, 2 million new Latino voters, 700,000 new Asian American voters. And they voted 75% for the first black president. So if you're the opposition party and the fastest growing demographics in the country have just voted overwhelmingly against you, what do? The way I see it, you only have 2 options. You change your policies, try to reach out to more people, make an argument why people should support you. Support things like racial justice and immigration reform and a higher minimum wage and doing something about climate change and all the things that appeal to this new generation of voters. Or if you don't do that, you go back further to a very old strategy in American history. You try to prevent those people that disagree with you from voting in the first place. And that's what we saw after the 2010 election, when so many critical states, places like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Michigan that would decide the next president, changed their voting laws to make it harder for certain people to vote by doing things like requiring strict IDs that you never needed in any previous election and that millions of Americans didn't have, purging the voting rolls, cutting back early voting, closing polling places, disenfranchising ex-offenders. It wasn't one tactic, it wasn't one state. We saw in 2011 to 2012 alone 180 voting restrictions introduced in 41 states. And half the states in their country changed their voting laws to make it harder to vote. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act. And they said that those states with the longest histories of discrimination, places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, but also parts of California and also parts of New York where I live, no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And a few things happened as a result of this decision. The first thing that happened was that laws that were actually blocked as discriminatory, like a voter ID law in Texas, where you could vote with a gun permit but not a student ID, were allowed to go into effect. So blatantly discriminatory and racist laws that had already been struck down in court were allowed to go into effect. The second thing is that states passed more sweeping restrictions on voting. So a month after the Supreme Court said that voter suppression was largely a thing of the past, North Carolina, which was the most progressive of all the southern states, changed their voting laws. They adopted strict voter ID. They cut early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. They even eliminated Citizens Awareness Month, which the state of North Carolina did to encourage people to register to vote. And this was challenged in court. And there were some remarkable facts that came out. One of the things that North Carolina did is they eliminated voting on the Sundays before the election. States like California that have early voting, Sunday is a very popular day to vote because a lot of people don't work, and that's also when African American churches hold Souls to the Polls voter mobilization drives. So the federal court, where this lawsuit was challenged, asked the state of North Carolina, why did you eliminate Sunday voting? And North Carolina said, well, some people were using it more than others. So they asked the obvious follow-up question, well, who was using it more than others? And the state of North Carolina said, counties that were disproportionately Democratic and disproportionately African American. And the federal court said, you just admitted to us in federal court that you did this to discriminate against people based on their party, but more significantly, based on their race. And they struck down this law in 2016 and said it targeted African American voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. And it's amazing to read this opinion and realize this was not written in 1876 or 1966. This was written in 2016 when people were surgically trying to remove African Americans and others from the voting rolls. You saw it in plain sight what was going on. The third thing that happened after 2010 was that voter suppression spread to the north. I think a lot of people think of this as a Southern problem. It's not just a Southern problem anymore. I was in the state of Wisconsin for the 2016 election, so I just want to tell you one story about what I saw. Wisconsin was one of those states that adopted a strict voter ID law, and the federal court said that 300,000 registered voters didn't have these strict forms of ID. So I wrote about one man, a 58-year-old African-American man named Eddie Lee Holloway Jr., who moved from Chicago to Milwaukee before the 2016 election. He had an ID for Illinois, but that wasn't a valid ID for Wisconsin because he needed a Wisconsin ID. So he could use his Illinois ID to get on a plane and buy Sudafed and do all the other things that people say you need an ID to do. But he couldn't vote in Wisconsin with that ID. So he went to the DMV in Milwaukee, said, I want to get an ID to be able to vote in Wisconsin. And the DMV looked at his birth certificate, and they said that the name on his birth certificate said Eddie Jr. Holloway instead of Eddie Lee Holloway Jr. because of a clerical error when it was issued. Now, it was obvious it was him. He had ID. He was 58 years old. He'd been voting his whole life. But they said he had to go down to Vital Records in Milwaukee and amend his birth certificate there. So he went down to Vital Records in Milwaukee. He said, I want to amend my birth certificate. How much will it cost? They told him between $400 and $600. Now, this was inaccurate information. It only cost $20. But that's what they told him. So he had to go back to Illinois and amend it there. So he went back to Illinois where he was from. He went to Springfield, the state capital. He said, I want to amend my birth certificate. They said, we need to see your high school, your vaccination records. He went to Decatur, Illinois, where he was from, got his high school records, went back to Springfield and said, can I amend my birth certificate? They said, no, we need to see your full Social Security statement. At that point, he went back to Wisconsin, got all his information in order, called Illinois and said, can I email or fax you my documents? And they said, no, you have to come back and do it in person. And at this point, he gave up. This one man who had voted his entire life made 7 trips to different government agencies in 2 different states, spent nearly $200 of his own money, and still wasn't able to vote in Wisconsin in 2016. And this sounds like a crazy story, and it is, but I have dozens and dozens of stories like this. And after the 2016 election, there was a study by the University of Wisconsin, and they found that up to 23,000 people in 2 counties alone, the 2 most Democratic counties in the state, Dane County, where Madison is, and Milwaukee County, that up to 23,000 people were deterred from voting by the state's voter ID law, and that African Americans were 3 times as likely as whites to be blocked or deterred from voting from this one law. Up to 23,000 people deterred from voting in a state that Donald Trump won by 22,000 votes. So people ask me all the time, did voter suppression impact the election? And the answer is obviously yes. But the more distressing thing is that one party deliberately made it harder for people to vote. It was a huge national scandal, and it got almost no attention. There were 25 presidential debates in 2016. It was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And there wasn't a single question about the attack on voting rights or the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. We've had 5 presidential debates in 2020, and still not a single question about the attack on voting rights or the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And my major fear is that we are once again allowing voter suppression to become the new normal. People made a lot of arguments in favor of literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and property requirements. You go back and read the history. These things were popular in Alabama. They were popular in Mississippi. People said people were too dumb to vote. They were inferior races. Every possible argument was made in favor of restricting the electorate. And now my fear is we're going to say, it's okay that someone couldn't vote because they didn't have the right ID. Or it's okay that someone couldn't make it to their polling place because their polling place was eliminated. Or it's okay that someone couldn't vote on Sunday because there was no longer Sunday voting. That's not okay. We have to have a national consensus in this country that that is not okay, that voter suppression cannot become the new normal. So I fear that if we don't address this, if we have 25 more debates without questions about voting rights, if we have candidates not talking about this issue, if we don't mobilize against it, if people don't know what their laws are and are prepared for it, that history is going to repeat itself in 2020. From 2012 to 2018 alone, almost 1,700 polling places have been eliminated in states that had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. We just learned yesterday, it's hard to keep track of the news, but we just learned yesterday that Donald Trump told the Russians, I don't have a problem with election interference. I don't have a problem with hacking. We did it. We did it in Iran. We did it in a bunch of countries. So what's the problem if the Russians do it to us? Now you might dismiss it, but remember, parts or all of 14 states are going to vote in 2020 on voting machines with no paper backups. Mitch McConnell still has not allowed a vote on election security. So this is not just a theoretical conversation between the president and his Russian friends in the White House. This is an urgent threat to our democracy that has still remained unaddressed. And if we don't do it soon, we're going to run out of time. It's not like you just roll in and put a bunch of voting machines in a day before the election. So we are running out of time to secure our elections. The good news is that states are actually doing something to try to expand voting rights, that in reaction to voter suppression, states are finally getting serious about expanding access to the ballot. And a lot of it starts right here in California, and that's the good news. California was the first state in the country to have a combination of automatic voter registration, election day registration, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, and a state version of the Voting Rights Act. So California, while certainly not perfect, is trying to send a different kind of message, that we want people to be able to vote, that we believe that the electorate should reflect the diversity of our state. And what I saw after 2010 was that the pendulum was all in one direction, that when Texas made it harder to vote, then Wisconsin followed. And when Wisconsin made it harder to vote, then Pennsylvania followed. And all the dominoes fell in one way. Sorry, I got a little too worked up there. All the dominoes fell in one way. And now we're seeing the opposite. In 2015, Oregon was the first state to pass automatic voter registration. Now 16 states have automatic voter registration. So just in a few years, we've seen a bunch of new states adopt policies that are going to make it easier to register and easier to vote. In 2018, we saw 8 states pass ballot initiatives to expand voting rights. Florida voted to expand voting rights to ex-offenders. 5 states decided to do independent redistricting. A bunch of other states did things like election day registration and automatic registration. So there is a movement for democracy in this country. House Democrats, as the Congresswoman can tell you, have introduced H.R. 1, which is a sweeping democracy reform bill that would make it far easier to vote and much harder to buy an election. So a lot of good things are happening when it comes to voting rights. But I think we need to look at the big picture of our democracy. If we make it easier to vote, but people don't have anything to vote for, that's also going to be a problem. So I just want to quickly talk about gerrymandering, which is another huge threat to democracy. In states like Wisconsin, which also have the worst voter suppression laws, they've also passed among the most gerrymandered maps in the country. In 2018 in Wisconsin, Republican candidates got 46% of the vote for the State House of Representatives, but 64% of the seats. In places like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Michigan and Pennsylvania, you have one party getting fewer votes, but many more seats. In 6 states, a minority of the voters elected a majority of the legislature. That means that 60 million Americans live under minority rule in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. That goes against everything we say we are as a democracy. We think that the person that gets the most votes should be the one that holds office. But that's not how it worked in our presidential election, and that's not how it's working in state elections either. And now the Supreme Court, as the mayor said, they've said, we're not even going to review partisan gerrymandering. It doesn't matter if a Republican says, I drew this map specifically to prevent Democrats from gaining representation, or a Democrat does the same kind of thing. The Supreme Court said, not only do we not have a problem with this, but federal courts can't even review it. So that makes the states all the more important. I happen to believe that every state should adopt the kind of independent redistricting commissions that we have in California. I think that's a model for the rest of the country. But if states don't do that, we have to recognize that the state legislative elections in 2020 are going to determine the course of democracy for the next decade. That we're not just electing a new president, we are electing the state legislatures that are going to draw the redistricting maps in 2021 for the next decade. And I think that's an issue that doesn't seem to be on anybody's radar. But it's a lot easier to impact a state legislative race than it is to try to flip the presidential election. So I hope this is something that people will think about. And that brings me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is the 2020 census. And thank you to the Census Bureau for being here. So the census really is the DNA of our democracy. It's how we allocate political and economic power. Because of the census, $880 billion is allocated for programs like Medicaid and Medicare and Pell Grants and school lunches and Section 8 housing. Virtually every program we use is determined in some way or another by the census. The census determines how House districts are drawn. The census determines, in large part, how many electoral college votes states receive. So the census is critically, critically important. We've done it every 10 years since 1790, when U.S. Marshals pledged to have a perfect enumeration of the population. And actually, the census is mentioned as one of the first mandates in the Constitution before they talk about how you select Congress or how you select judges. They talk about the importance of the census. So the census is critically important, but it's under unprecedented threat. I'm sure you all know how Donald Trump tried to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. They claimed it was needed to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. As someone who studies voting rights, I found this to be a very interesting argument, because there hasn't been a question about citizenship on the census since 1950. But the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. So they hadn't needed a citizenship question to enforce the Voting Rights Act in the entire 50-plus year history of the Voting Rights Act. And every single voting rights lawyer I knew said we didn't need this question to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And you had an administration that still hasn't filed a single lawsuit to enforce the Voting Rights Act, saying we need a citizenship question to better enforce a law that they clearly have no interest in enforcing. So they said we need this question to enforce the Voting Rights Act. This made the push for the Iraq War look honest by comparison. Well, we learned that a Republican redistricting expert, the guy who gerrymandered places like North Carolina and so many states across the country. We learned during the course of litigation against the citizenship question that he said you needed this question on the census so that you could draw districts that, in his words, would be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. And in his words, clearly a disadvantage to Democrats and Hispanics. So we had this really, really compelling information. The citizenship question had nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act, but it was all about shifting power from communities of color to wider and more homogenous areas. And we'll never know why the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act, the same Supreme Court that said you can't review partisan gerrymandering, decided to block this question. But I think it was because of this evidence. Because John Roberts said in his majority opinion, you can have a citizenship question on the 2020 census, but you have to have a good reason for it. And Roberts said the administration's reason, in his words, quote, seems to have been contrived. That's a very polite way of saying you're lying. So they blocked this question, but where are we at now? If the question isn't on the form, where are we at now? That's the important thing. So a few things I just want to say about that. The same day the president appeared in the Rose Garden with Wilbur Ross in a rare moment when he was awake, and his good friend, the Attorney General William Barr, he said, we're not going to have a citizenship question, but I'm going to direct the Census Bureau to compile citizenship information on every American using administrative records. And then he said, states may want to use this for redistricting. And that was the tell, because that was clearly the purpose of the citizenship question all along. So what does that mean? Without getting too technical, for decades and decades, everyone has counted when you draw districts. I'm sure if you ask the Congresswoman, who do you represent? Do you represent voters? Or do you also represent children? Do you also represent non-citizens? Do you also represent immigrant communities? I'm sure she will tell you. She represents everybody. If there's a fire at your house, the fire department's going to put it out. They're not going to ask you for your citizenship or how old you are before they come in and put out the fire. What the administration wants to do is they want to draw districts excluding non-citizens and excluding non-voters. That means that people like my daughters, they won't be counted. Immigrants who are here legally, they won't be counted. Immigrants who are undocumented but are doing jobs and paying taxes, they won't be counted. So there'll be a huge shift in representation. If you could draw districts excluding non-voters, that will exclude 55% of Latinos, 45% of Asian Americans, and 30% of African Americans from political representation. This is kind of below everyone's radar, but this is one of their major ways they're going to try to hold power in 2021 and forestall the major demographic changes that are happening in this country. So they're doing that. There are still some other major issues with the census. I was just in Texas last week, and I was with Latino organizers in places like Houston, which, just like California, are at a huge risk of an undercount. And I said, how do people feel about the census now that there's no citizenship question? And they said, in our community, the question is still on there. That they heard that Donald Trump wanted their information. And no matter what the Supreme Court said, that fear is still out there. And it's not going to be easily erased when families are separated from their children, and people are called rapists and murderers, and entire religions are banned from being able to enter this country. It's not going to be easy to erase that fear. And there's unfortunately a precedent for this fear, that during World War II, the Census Bureau collected information on Japanese Americans and gave them to the Secret Service in California to put 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. Now, there are strict confidentiality standards in the census. You can't do that anymore. You can't share your information with DHS or ICE or anyone else. But the fear is still out there. That's something that's going to be very, very difficult to overcome. There's been budget cuts. The Census Bureau was told you have to spend less money on the 2010 census. Sorry, they said you have to spend less money on the 2020 census than the 2010 census, even though there's going to be 25 million more people to count and inflation. So the Census Bureau had to cancel all of these field tests they do to prepare for 2020. They had to cancel field tests on Native American reservations. They had to cancel field tests in Puerto Rico. They had to cancel field tests in rural West Virginia. They held one field test in Providence, Rhode Island, pretty recently. The New York Times said it was the equivalent of holding a Broadway play with a single rehearsal in New Haven. No offense to New Haven, but shows don't usually premiere there. So this is a major undertaking that a lot of people don't feel has been properly prepared for. There's also a potential digital divide. This is going to be the first year in which people fill out the census online. So 80% of Americans are going to be sent, instead of being sent a paper form, they're going to be sent a postcard saying, this is how you fill out the census online. And some hard-to-count communities will still receive a paper form, and then someone will knock on the door if they don't fill it out. That's going to make the census a lot more convenient for some people. It'll make it more convenient for people like me that do everything on their phones. But in an era of Russian interference, in an era of disinformation, an era where major credit card companies and so many other people have their information hacked, people are worried about conducting the census online. Not only that, but a quarter of African Americans and a quarter of Latinos don't have reliable internet access at home. So they could also slip through the cracks. So all of this just increases the pressure on the 2020 census. And California's been at the vanguard of trying to get a fair census. California's spending $150 million on the census, which is more than any other state. But I don't think just spending the money is enough. I think the census has to go from being a dry, wonky issue that people think about maybe once every 10 years to really a defining civil rights issue of our time. I think the census has to be as important as the fight against voter suppression, as the fight against gerrymandering, as the fight against Russian interference, because all of these things are connected. And ultimately, it's about what kind of democracy are we going to have? Are we going to have a democracy in which every person in America is counted? Or are we going to have a democracy in which some communities are counted, but others are not? Are we going to have a democracy in which we have fair maps, where anyone can run and win for office, or where outcomes are predetermined based on who draws the maps? Are we going to have a democracy where everyone has a right to vote, which was the central promise of the Voting Rights Act? Or are we going to have a democracy in which some people can vote, but not others? So those are the challenges we face in 2020 and beyond, and that's why voting rights and democracy needs to be such a front and center issue for the next year and beyond. Thank you so much for having me.
Mr. Ari Berman, one more round of applause for Ari. Thank you, Ari. That was amazing. Learned a lot. Whew, we got a lot of work to do. So we're going to ask for closing remarks this evening from our Congresswoman. Congresswoman Barbara Lee is a founding force of the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center back in her assembly days. Of course, former state assembly member and state senator serving in her 11th term in Congress. Congresswoman Lee is the former chair of the Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucus and is the highest-ranking African-American woman in congressional history. It's my understanding that the Congresswoman just literally flew in, got to the airport, and is rushing over here. And on behalf of all of us, Congresswoman, we thank you for the beautiful example you set for all of us in terms of how we can become stewards of our democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congresswoman Barbara Lee for closing remarks.
Well, it's good to be home. In the last 7 days, I've been in D.C., South Carolina, North Carolina, Las Vegas, Southern California, and back here at home. It has been quite a week. And Ari, where's Ari? I just want to tell you how much, first of all, I appreciate your being here and laying out all of the really the lanes of democracy that are all threatened by now by this Mack truck. and I was mentioning to Elihu that, our democracy is very fragile right now. It's very fragile. And all week in Washington, D.C., we were meeting about the census. In addition to the political ramifications of the census, just the resource allocation of your tax dollars, where money goes in terms of health care and schools, and for food stamps and programs for job training, and you just name it. The census all determines that. And they're trying to stop people of color really from participating and for having an equal and fair and just type of government at this point. I mean, I see this, if we don't stay woke, turning back to those days. And you laid it out. And now we have, of course, in the White House, a president, an occupant of the White House, who at every turn tries to undermine the rule of law. He threatens our democracy on all fronts. So you have the highest office in the land trying to take us in another direction. And so, no, I voted for impeachment 3 times and very proud of that vote, those 3 votes. Let me tell you, I'm just glad that our colleagues have caught up with where we have been. We knew that this man has obstructed justice and has abused power and has profited from being in the White House, violated the Emoluments Clause. There were many reasons why I didn't go to the inauguration and to the State of the Union, some of which I just laid out. And so we have got to understand now what's taking place. But we can't let them do what they are trying to do. And so, Ari, you really, in a very clear, succinct, logical fashion, laid out the threats, because these are all threats. And they're coming at us in all different directions. And so the people have to rise up now and understand and say very loudly that this is